Heat waves and wildfires are ravaging Europe. Crops raised, prices rising, inequality widening. How much can we handle? And what happens when the world's fastest warming continent gets even hotter?
Doom.
Tim Benton is a food security expert.
No, the challenge is that almost everything that we can do to make our food system more resilient will cost.
But he argues that politics gets in the way. Budgets are limited. Election cycles are short.
What we're kind of tending to do is to try and put sticking plasters onto everything rather than do the large-scale fundamental changes until they become absolutely necessary. And at some point in the future, it will become absolutely necessary, and we will have to change the way that we farm in Europe and across the world, but we're not yet at that point. We're just sort of hoping it will go away, or hoping 2026 won't be repeated, but it will be repeated, and it will be repeated increasingly frequently as the years go on.
I don't know how many more heat waves I can handle. Western Europe had the hottest June on record. A severe heat wave sizzled southern parts, spreading east, continuing into July. Drought decimated the continent's prime agricultural zones. Harvests were down by about 9 million tonnes compared to growers' forecasts before the big heat hit. It's estimated to have cost the continent's grain farmers €2 billion in lost revenue, according to the Energy and Climate Intelligence Unit, a think tank. That doesn't include wider costs of the heatwave, like lost vegetable crops and livestock. There is a silver lining, but it's not all that reassuring.
European harvests have not been very good at all right across Europe, but some harvests in other parts of the world have been better than expected. Canada, India, Turkey for wheat, for example. So in a stable world, that food would be kind of shuffled around so that the people who want it and are willing to pay for it get it. But we don't live in a stable world anymore, and so there is a risk on relying on greater imports into Europe. There is a risk that it will become quite pricey, and if it does become quite pricey, we will on average be able to afford it across Europe because we're quite rich, but it will price other importing nations out of the market, and those are particularly in the developing world, who are much more reliant for absolute food security, actually getting hold of any food on the international market working very well. So our food security in Europe, more people will be challenged when it comes to filling their shopping basket. That is kind of almost inevitable over the next year or so.
I asked him which hotspots in Europe concern him most.
Of course, the south, France, which is increasingly Mediterranean these days, and that whole kind of desertification possibility of the Mediterranean moving northwards. But from a kind of global interconnectedness perspective, every country is vulnerable for the reasons that I've been outlining, because even if you produce a lot of food, you're still reliant on ingredients and packaging and nitrogen coming from other places, and that's all disruptable, whether by climate itself or climate interacting with geopolitical needs and strategies. 2026 has been a wake-up call across Europe. 2027 on a global basis is going to be hotter, 1.76 degrees above baseline, when we're still supposed to be, according to the Paris Agreement, striving for under 1.5 degrees. Quite how the El Nino will work out and what its impacts will be, no one really knows. We've only got historical examples, and this is going to be probably the biggest El Nino in history.
But do we ever learn from history? Well, Professor Benton says there are enough very recent historical examples that show how environmental crises in any one place in the world can trigger major economic and political discord almost everywhere else.
Well, if you look back at the last 20-odd years of history, the big issues around food price inflation, cost of living crises, and pushing people into food insecurity within Europe particularly come from 2007-8, which was a big drought in Australia, 2010-11, which was an extreme heat wave in Ukraine and Western Russia. It come from COVID, which may or may not have a biological origin caused by biodiversity disruption and land use change, and came from the blockade of Odessa and the invasion of Ukraine, and from the closure of the Straits of Hormuz. And all of these things are both climate related and geopolitically related, and it is the interaction between the two that becomes most difficult. And at the moment, we've obviously had an unprecedented period of heat across Europe, but we're also moving into the strongest ever El Nino, which tends to act by rewiring global agriculture, plus adding heat into the atmosphere. So next year is forecast now to be 1.76 degrees higher than the pre-industrial baseline, so 1.76 degrees of climate change. That in itself will be disruptive, and let alone what happens with the Iran war, the Ukraine war, and any other points of geopolitical tension around the world. Looking ahead, El Nino, on top of all the rest, is going to continue to drive food prices up and availability down.
Tim says we're caught in a vicious spiral. The way out? We'll talk about solutions soon. First, more about what happens when you couple climate change with divisive geopolitics.
Climate acts as a kind of amplifier on top of the underlying geopolitical international affairs situation. And it's, quite frightening what is happening in the world at the moment from a climate perspective. And you layer that on top of an unstable world with Trumpian trade wars and all of the other things that are going on, shooting wars in Europe, shooting wars in the Middle East, then you have quite a kind of volatility in being able to guarantee our supply when we need it. For me, whatever's happened that's driven our food price spikes over the last 20 years has normally been something less than 1% of global production, agricultural production. And I can easily imagine situations where the combined global effects of, if you just look at the Northern Hemisphere this year, we've had extreme heat in Europe, but we've had extreme wet in other places, that actually nowhere has good weather. And therefore good yields. And what would happen if we lost 5 or 10% of global agricultural production instead of 1% of global agricultural production? As I keep saying, in a calm and stable world, we would just move the food around and make sure that there was enough aid and food aid to reduce the inevitable distributional consequences. But we're not in a calm and stable world. And if there are countries that are really threatened because of a food crisis within their countries, the world we're living in is that they will use economic and shooting wars to potentially get their food supplies and ensure their own food security. And so we could be in a world where, looking ahead, these sorts of conflicts just get worse because strong countries are using their muscles to grab food, leaving the poor countries to scrabble around and get what they can. And so you could be in a situation that worst case scenario was some sort of large scale conflict over a small pot of food, and therefore, quite painful for everybody.
But could it really come to civil war in, say, the United States, a scenario many analysts have been discussing, according to Tim, or another French Revolution here in Europe?
Well, one of the contributory causes of the French Revolution was the food price inflation caused by bad weather at the time, and then pricing people out of being able to afford themselves. And of course, food is a very, very potent reason for driving civil unrest and getting people out on the streets. And so if the proportion of people in any country that really struggle to feed themselves increases, then obviously that's going to be, the potential for a spark. And if you look back in the 2007, 8, 10, 11 food price spikes, food price inflation was a major determinant around the world of civil unrest and riots and all the rest of that. So looking ahead, if we don't deal with this, then it's kind of inevitable that inequality will continue to grow and people will get disaffected.
But to the extent that war breaks out?
Yes, I think so. You can see some of the tensions in many countries around the world where the polarization of politics is such that there is a very big proportion of disaffected people. And so you layer on top of that not being able to have access to food in an affordable way, then you do have the kind of the boiling cauldron of simmering disaffection that can lead to these sorts of things happening.
So how long does that cauldron have to simmer away before it starts boiling and suddenly boils over?
So if we have a bad year next year and the Iran war is escalating and the Ukraine war is escalating and something else happens, then we could be in for a very sticky year from a food price perspective and availability perspective. And then in the decades ahead, it's always difficult because weather is a kind of ultimately a random process driven by a set of rules. We might not have another year like 2026 for 10 years, 20 years, but it will come. And we're going to have more bad years. Other places are going to have more bad years as well. And how that all sums up together really depends on whether or not we go back to a more stable cooperative world, or whether what's been happening in the last 5 to 10 years just accelerates away, and the geopolitical tensions and the contestation and the conflict that we are living through get worse.
What about the large-scale stuff that's absolutely necessary to make a change?
It's perfectly possible to imagine a world which could be food secure with a different sort of farming. To build resilience in agriculture, you kind of need diversity. You need to grow different things in different ways. Probably integrate livestock into arable and horticultural landscapes so that you're not reliant on imported fertilizer and all the rest of that. And all of that will come with a cost in terms of yields, and it will come with a cost in terms of the cost of food in supermarkets or markets or whatever. The other issue is that because we are globally embedded, it's not necessarily, our food security is not necessarily about our own agriculture. It's about whether or not we can get the ingredients that we need for our food. So how do you build a resilient global trading system? That is the challenge in a world of contestation and conflict and economic power projection. And it would essentially mean not necessarily a deglobalization, but a reglobalization, that you're preferentially trading with allies, not foes. And that comes with the cost, that you're building up food stocks in your home or your locality or your country or your region, that you're diversifying your trade routes so that you don't put all your eggs in one basket and rely on goods from a country that might in turn be hit by climate change in a given year, and so on. So building a resilient food system is not just about agriculture, it's about reshaping the global economy and therefore reshaping geopolitics. And that's why it's such a big ask in a way, because the world in which we're living is not about nations cooperating with nations anymore. It's about nations projecting their power to get what they want, and therefore saying, let's have a nice, cool, calm, collected, cooperative world. Seems a bit implausible given the current politics that are driving us.
A sobering reality check. But it's amazing how history repeats itself, how we learn so little, and how it all comes back to politics at the end of the day. Let us know if you think food security could spark a revolution. I'm Ben Fajzullin in Berlin.